don't believe that you're going to actually siphon away moderate votes and delegates from Joe Biden?
Joe Biden, if you're right, it's going to be siphoning votes away from me.
How so?
Well, the same way, if you think I'm going to siphon them from him, he's siphoning them from me.
You're going to stay in throughout?
Turn around.
Thank you.
I'm going to be there on November 3rd.
But I mean, you're going to be running until November 3rd?
Plan to.
Well, not so much. That was Marc Caputo, longtime friend of the show, asking the questions of the presidential candidate on the trail, Michael Bloomberg. And Marc joins us now. Good morning, Marc.
Good morning.
So you've been covering Biden. You've been covering Florida for Politico, long time with the Miami Herald and everywhere else. That moment with Bloomberg. So describe that for me just a little bit, because it always seems strange to me that he was in Florida on Super Tuesday.
Well, yeah, earlier I asked him, why are you here in Florida? And he made some comments to the effect that he was going to win Florida, or he likes being in Florida. Wasn't really a responsive reply. And also, I think the most damaging reply in that whole exchange was at the very beginning, where I said, what do you say to the criticism that your candidacy helps Bernie Sanders? And he says, I'm not trying to help Bernie Sanders, I'm trying to help myself. Which, if you're running for office, you want to say, I'm doing this to help America, yeah. God, Mom, apple pie, all that stuff.
At least there was a recognition on his part pretty quickly after Super Tuesday that, look, my theory of the case is not working. I thought Joe was going to collapse. And it actually, to be honest with you, if he had turned in a good debate performance, that very first debate, I think he might have taken off. But but Elizabeth Warren gutted him.
Yeah, she came out of there like a samurai and cut his head off, then told everyone to fight over the remains. It was a pretty impressive political assassination on stage. I don't think one we've seen in a long time. I think one of the interesting things about Bloomberg's campaign is that it still exists. He has recobbled and retooled it. It's going to basically turn into a super PAC, helping Biden, or whoever the nominee is going to be right now. It looks like Biden, and planning to take on Trump in the general election. We do see that he did rather well for a candidate who essentially didn't campaign except but for a few weeks. On television, his ads did move the needle in a number of places.
And they were very well done. I mean, money can buy you a really good team. They can't make a candidate, but they can. But the packaging around that candidate was really good until he started opening his mouth.
Right. It's just difficult in this era to say, I'm not going to release women from their NDAs and sexual harassment cases. It's very difficult to do if you're going to stand next to Elizabeth Warren on a Democratic presidential debate stage.
Or that they may not have just liked a few of the jokes I said. Yeah. You know, so you said just a second ago, and I want to circle back to it, that it's the way the contests are now lining up, it favors Joe Biden. Why do you believe it favors Joe Biden?
Well, it passed as prologue, and anything can happen, so we'll have to specify that. But in Super Tuesday, 14 states voted, and Joe Biden won 10 of them. And he didn't just win African Americans, which were kind of a base of his. He won suburban whites, rural whites. He won women. The only thing he did badly with were among Latino voters and younger voters. And to a degree, there's a lot of overlap there. When you start to look at the map going forward, Michigan, for instance, is going to be this Tuesday. That's a big state for not only delegates, but also symbolic reasons. It's a place where Bernie Sanders has basically said is an example of how his candidacy is going to help him beat Trump. Well, Bernie Sanders can't win Michigan. That's going to be problematic. But when you look at these broader states, the run of states in March, they look a lot like the Super Tuesday states that already voted without California. So the profile of voters lean more Biden in their demographics, and therefore it's looking more and more likely that it's a Biden nomination.
So let's talk about the role that Florida could play on March 17th. You know, depending on how those states go, we're talking about this coming Tuesday, Michigan, Mississippi, Missouri, Idaho, Washington among them. Michigan being the big prize there. But you can expect a pretty good split. Probably Biden walks out of that contest with more delegates than not, but around close. But that following Tuesday, you know, the second mini Super Tuesday, you know, Florida, Ohio, Arizona, Illinois. Florida could bury Bernie Sanders, could it not?
Right. Florida is a state that's kind of traditionally been hostile to Bernie Sanders. If you just look at Hillary Clinton just blew the doors off of him here in 2016. She won by about like 30 points or so.
And in 2016, he didn't start making Fidel Castro comments.
Right. A political consultant I know had done some focus groups of Hispanic Democrats in Florida. One woman had said when she saw the 60 Minutes comments, she began to cry. Another woman said she was making her dinner, and her dinner burned because she was transfixed by how clueless and awful the comments from Bernie Sanders were. Now, these are Cuban-American women, but understand, it's not just what you know limited to Cuban-Americans. Venezuelan Americans don't like the failure to roundly condemn Maduro. Same thing with Nicaraguan Americans, with Ortega.
Well, it's almost as if sort of saying, you know, like, why can't we acknowledge that Mussolini had the trains running on time in Italy? You know?
We as good Italians would not say that, for instance.
Yes.
And there's a reason that candidates haven't come to Florida and said, sure, Castro was bad, but the education was great. There's a reason that conventional wisdom exists and is right in some cases, that doesn't strike the ear of the electorate very soundly. And in fact, you know, it's not just Latinos, it's also suburban whites don't like it. When I was in South Carolina, I talked to an African-American engineer, a man in Greenville, who said he was voting for Biden. I said, why not vote for Sanders? He said he's a socialist. Well, I talked to a state senator in Texas, an African-American named Royce West. And I said, who's going to win Texas? He said, Joe Biden. Why not Bernie Sanders? He says, Texas isn't going to vote for a socialist. These are African-Americans saying that, not Cuban-Americans, African-Americans in other states.
Well, the other thing that I think that the Bernie Sanders, Fidel Castro comments sort of made clear was that, you know, if you couldn't find a way to nuance a 40-year-old quote, you know, in a current election cycle, it just again showed what we were talking about a little bit before. Bernie Sanders is incredibly consistent, much to his supporters' delight, but also often to his detriment.
Right. I mean, in the end, Bernie Sanders is a committed leftist. I don't think he is a Castro apologist. I don't think, as he said, he's a Maduro apologist. But there are elements of the revolutions that he really liked, and that can be problematic in a state like this.
So, you know, I want to play one Bernie Sanders clip. Let's play that Bernie Sanders sound, and we'll talk about it on the other side.
We are taking on the political establishment, and that's just your point. In the last few days, what we've seen a consolidation. Political establishment was very, very nervous because you had a number of establishment candidates. And then the establishment candidates got out, some of them. Buttigieg got out, Amy Klobuchar got out, Bloomberg got out, and they consolidated around Joe Biden. And Wall Street is emptying its checkbooks to fund Joe's campaign.
I got to imagine that a lot of folks listening to that in South Carolina, other states, even states moving forward, suburban women, African Americans, suddenly realizing that Bernie Sanders considers him a tool of Wall Street at this point.
Well, Cedric Richmond, he is a congressman from Louisiana and the campaign co-chair for Joe Biden, told us the other day that he's talking about the establishment. Why is he saying this about African Americans? Essentially, pointing out what you did in a little harder of a way, that, you know, this talk is not received very well by the Democratic base. Exit polling from Super Tuesday, by the way, showed that Bernie Sanders does best when there are independents, that is non-Democrats, voting in a primary. It is kind of difficult to say, hey, I'm here to win your party primary, and your party sucks.
We only have about 30 seconds. Where Bernie Sanders could turn it around and where Joe Biden could stumble is the next debate. It's just going to be him and Bernie Sanders on stage with not a lot of cover there. That could be an interesting moment, which I believe is on the 15th, just before Florida's primary.
That's true. You're seeing a number of Sanders supporters online join with Trump supporters and question Joe Biden's mental acuity. That's going to become an issue that we're going to hear a lot more about, and you might see it on stage.
All right. Marc Caputo, thank you very much for your time. I'm sure we'll have you back on. The campaign trail gets interesting. We'll be right back after the break.